aku nui e aku rahi tēnei te mehumaha ki a koutou. Kei te mea hoki hokainga o tēnei rohe, arako ngai tuahuriri, ngā mihi nui. Kia ora koutou, hello, good morning, welcome. My name is Kaila Colbin. I'm the founder and chief executive of Boma, and it is my honor to welcome you to today's Signals from the Future with the one and only Melissa Clark-Reynolds ONZM. Melissa is one of our favorite presenters, friends of Boma, dear friend of mine. We've known each other a long time. We've been through a lot of stuff together. These sessions are always fascinating, always lots of stuff to chew on, lots of thought-provoking stuff. I'm so excited to hear what you have to say. I'm just going to turn it straight over to you. Let's hear what we got.
Oh, kia ora mai tātou. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. I know I've got people from all over the world here, people in Paris, people in Pale Bear, people in the US and New Zealand and Australia. So thanks for coming. One of the things I really love about this is just a number of these have actually been crowdsourced by some of you, have sent them in, and I'm loving how we're getting a bit of a community around these. And part of why I like this is I do these regular signals sessions for my clients, but I love that I get to do it today where I'm the client. And so you get what I'm thinking about without really having the filter of what somebody else might pay me for. And I think just as a little bit of background about signals is this idea really we need strategic foresight. And strategic foresight allows us to make much better decisions in the face of uncertainty. So one of the things as futurists, we think about these big mega trends that are affecting the world, but I have a particular interest in these very small signals, things that are actually like in the world that I start to wonder about where they might go. And from the Institute for the Future, where I trained many years ago now, is this idea of we look for small, often weird things, and then we try to understand where they might lead 10 or more years down the road. And I actually found it really tricky doing today because there's so much noise in the world at the moment that it's really easy to get distracted by the noise. But I have an interest in business models as well as new products, as well as big global geopolitical events. So hopefully today there's a little of something for everyone. And the first one I want to kick off with is kind of a sweet one. It's this company called Fern. And what I find so interesting about this company, I've been actually following it for about 3 years, is that many of you who've heard me before know that the rise of the subscription business model was probably the biggest thing that's happened in the 21st century. We saw it emerge from technology companies who moved from sort of installed enterprise-wide software, and then what they moved to, or we moved to, was software as a service. The idea that you can separate ownership and use is probably one of the big ideas to me in business for this century. So that what I used to need to own, I can now rent or I can have on demand. And we can see that whether it's in the Ubers or whether it's in zip cars or whether it's in renting fashion, I've talked about in these signals before. And it's that whole idea of how do we separate ownership and use? But the other piece is how do I get people to subscribe for my service? So the Spotifys of this world. How do I do that? And here what we have is a perfume subscription service. So I don't know what perfume I might get. To be fair, I haven't managed to sign up for this. I've never managed to find a window that was available. Excuse me. And so what you get is that you get a seasonal perfume arrives. And what I found interesting as I've watched them get this business model right and they tweak it is that they now send a small sample bottle as well as the big bottle. And you can try the sample. If you don't like it, you can return the bottle. But mostly people are using these as status symbols. They put them on their desk at work. They might use them at work. And it's part, to me, of a bigger cultural conversation. So there's this piece about subscription business models. There's a piece I've talked about before around gifting and the idea that I could gift a subscription to someone every quarter. They get a gift from me. I can see how this would fit into that gifting economy as well. And then there's this other piece, which is just kind of the surprise and delight factor. And we've seen the rise of self-care. And self-care isn't a word that I used to hear at all in the last century. Do you know, we didn't talk about self-care. And it's almost as if the world has got so stressful, we have to have these words rituals have come up more and more. So we hear about rituals for self-care, and getting something quarterly in the mail feels like yet another ritual for self-care. My next signal is in the AI world, and I've got a couple of AI signals today, but this first one here is this idea around AI coaching. And so what we can see is that this company, Valence, is doing incredibly well. It's a company that I've been watching for a little while. And with it, what we see is that they're providing these AI coaches into organizations. So instead of paying for a human coach, and what you see is perhaps at the senior levels of an organisation, they might get a dedicated coach. And then at tiers 3 or 4 or lower levels of an organisation, they might get an AI coach. And they can put into it this idea of how to, like a problem that I'm currently grappling with as a leader, or a problem I'm grappling with as a manager. And with that, what I can then get is some feedback. And what we're seeing is that there are more and more of these models, whether it's the ability to dial up an AI therapist or an AI coach. And I'm just really curious about where they go. But I think that this is very interesting for the coaching industry. And I'm fascinated by their value proposition here, which is grounded in your culture and values. So it's basically a highly customized chatbot that takes the values of that organization and puts it into the AI. But this other kicker at the end, 2% of the traditional cost. And in some of my other talks, I've talked about this idea of commodification, that over time, the price of everything drops to zero. So we've seen that happen with electricity, for example, in the last sort of couple of decades, where the price of solar is almost at zero for many people now once you've done your installation costs. And so, you know, where else, if we think about our businesses, how will we operate our businesses if the price drops to zero? And this is where the rise of the experience economy is the thing that has enabled people to put higher prices on top of what is fundamentally a commodified product. The next one is another AI one, and I think this is really fascinating. And in fact, so fascinating, I've actually done 2 slides on it, which sort of breaks my own rules. But what we see here is the development of, again, customized chatbots. So OnlyFans is a porn-saturated website, and fans can make a personal relationship with stars on the site. And with those stars, what they can do is that they can DM them, so they can personal message them. And with those personal messages, they can develop a relationship. Now, what's really interesting about this is that for quite a long time, OnlyFans stars have been what's the right word? They've been hiring chatters, as they're called, in cheaper economies. And so what they'll do is they'll write scripts, and then women or men are in India or the Philippines or other low-wage economies, and they have been doing live chat with the OnlyFans fans. Does that make sense? So this job called chatters has been around for quite some time, and they're basically, you know, they're paid to talk dirty to the customers. What the big development has been is the development of software tools like FlirtFlow, and FlirtFlow claims to be the number one in this market, where what they've done is that they've developed specific kind of almost like ERPs in a way, so workflows for OnlyFans stars that enable them to do custom chatbots, and those chatbots, they can program them to the kind of words they would use, the phrases they would use, the kinds of, say, sexting that is okay and the sexting that's not, what kind of images of themselves they're willing to share at what price, and you can automate the entire workflow so that the customer, the fan, doesn't necessarily, well, in fact, doesn't know that they're not talking with the celebrity that they think they're talking with. And so that used to happen with humans, and now it's happening with chatbots. And part of why I found this was because I was curious about what jobs are being replaced by AI. And so in previous talks, I've talked about just how much AI is disrupting the coding industry and how out of a coder now we get a good couple of hours out of a coder for what used to take them, what we got an hour, we're now getting like twice as much output out of a coder than we used to. And in a sense, by devolving first to chatters, now by laying those chatters off and replacing them with chatbots in the sex industry, we're seeing a whole lot of people being laid off. And so these don't tend to turn up in the Deloitte kind of whose job's been affected. But I've been watching this for a little while and I've just been super curious about whose jobs get disrupted. And so again, this is a commodification play where it was cheaper and easier and you could do 24-hour service by devolving the chats to the Philippines, to India, to wherever, and then from there being able to take that into a chatbot. And of course the chatbot here, it can be multilingual. I can talk dirty in Russian or I can talk dirty in French. Doesn't really make a difference so long as I've programmed that script and then put the box around what it is that I'm willing to talk about or not. So I find it interesting. I think that when we look back at the history of the internet, we'll be surprised at just how many innovations have come out of the porn industry. So let me be clear here, and I know Kaila will clarify this. When I look at these signals, I don't have a, is this good, is this bad? I'm not trying to pass judgment here on whether the job losses were good or bad, and I'm not trying to pass judgment on whether this industry is good or bad. I'm just super curious, and I went looking for where is AI actually disrupting people's employment. When we think again about robotics and AI, this is an area that, again, we are starting to see some commodification in, and robotic dentistry is really taking off. And I think this is kind of curious again. Dentists are hard to train, they're hard to come by, they don't necessarily stay a long time in their professions. And so this idea of being able to support dentists with better tools has been really interesting. And I'm going to, when you'll be able to get my slides at the end, and I've got a full list of references. And so here, I'll send you in that the reference specifically to this. And I almost put the videos in, and then I'm like, this is a bit much at breakfast for those of you who are in New Zealand or Australia. So they've got some fantastic videos on their site of robotic dentistry in action. And what we see here again is that dentists are able to do more, able to see more patients with more precision using these convergence of tools. So using AI, using machine vision, and using robotics at once. And I think we'll just start to get to a point where within a few years, we'll be expecting this. And we've seen robotic surgery, but robotic dentistry is really, I think, on the cusp of exploding. I have to thank Sally Davenport. I know she couldn't make it today, but I'm hoping that she'll watch this video, for sending me this image from the Tube in London. So anyone from the UK, you may have seen this image here on the right. I've never seen such a backlash against an individual owner. And we've seen the use of economic instruments in a way. I grew up in New Zealand in a time of the 81 Springbok tour. New Zealand had very strong economic sanctions against the racist regime that was in South Africa at the time. We had sports sanctions, we had economic sanctions. We've used economic sanctions in many other ways, just as the US is currently looking at the implementation of tariffs in a very broad way. Those economic sanctions have been in place at the country-to-country level for a long time, probably as long as trade has existed. And then we've seen perhaps boycotting of individual companies, and it may be for their ethics. So, supermarkets refusing to carry foie gras because they don't like gavage, or we see, individual backlashes against pillow companies or whatever it might be. the global backlash against Elon Musk at the moment is something I have never seen. And part of it, I think, is that we do live in these unprecedented times. I don't think ever before we've seen a kind of unelected vice president almost of the US behave in the way that we're seeing Musk behave. But related to that is just the absolute visceral anger against his products. And so I've been listening to a number of podcasts where Tesla owners talk about having their cars keyed in car parks. They're having them graffitied. We see people who are driving Cybertrucks becoming deeply embarrassed. We've seen the share price of Tesla plummet, and we're seeing lots of people offloading their cars because even though Tesla is like they make beautiful cars, people don't want to be associated with that brand. And I think this is just it's so interesting to me. And I wonder now what happens with Starlink. And I heard this morning that Canada has cancelled, or maybe it's Ontario, somewhere in Canada has cancelled a 100 million plus contract with Starlink. And I think I'm just watching to see if that will happen next. So if we're looking back in 6 months, I'll be kind of surprised if Starlink doesn't get a backlash against this as well. And I'm just wondering. So kind of fascinating in terms of asking yourselves questions about, are there parts of our brand that could turn toxic that we weren't expecting to? Are there ways where perhaps, Uber capitalism, he is doing what many capitalist owners would do, which is how do I curry favor with the government and how do I get the best contracts? I understand that, there is something like 38 billion of US government subsidies go to his companies at the moment a year. So all of that, I'm just curious about what, there's that double-edged sword, right? You put yourself out in public and then people have a lot more scrutiny of you. But the Nazi salute, that was probably the last straw for many, many people. And so just curious about where this goes and how it goes next. My next one is just, again, I have no idea what is going on with foreign policy. And we all live in countries that trade with each other. And trade is such an important part of global diplomacy. Plus, all of our governments, no matter what flavour they are, hire specialists in what's called soft power. So there are teams in our foreign agencies who work on what's called soft power. And soft power includes things like aid money, like World Health Organization money, like being part of the UN food programs. It's also about what allies we stand with and how we stand with it. And so at the moment, we're watching this, and I can hardly keep up hour by hour as to what is actually going on with US foreign policy. So I'm curious, does Five Eyes now become Four Eyes? Is the US now a Russian ally instead of a NATO ally? What does it mean for NATO? What does it mean to have these two images side by side, one of the US president fighting with or bullying really the president of Ukraine on television, and then within hours having this photograph below of other world leaders standing with that same president? I've just never seen so much kind of upset and disorder in global geopolitics. And I can't think of any time that it's been this hard to read the tea leaves. And then even on the left, the reason that I have John Bolton in here is John Bolton is a dedicated Republican, a lifelong Republican, and yet has been very, very critical of Trump's foreign policy on any platform that will take him. And again, really kind of pointing out that that Putin doesn't need to be saying anything at the moment because Trump is saying anything that Putin might want said, or Trump is negotiating for what Putin might want. I have to say, none of this was on my dance card. Do you know? Like, I did not predict this 2 or 3 years ago, and I kind of understand that we have that VUCA world where it's volatile, it's uncertain. There is so much change. But again, it's very, very hard to tell over the next couple of years where global allyship is going to land. And then this morning, I spent a couple of hours thinking about what do agricultural tariffs mean. I heard Trump this morning talking about American farmers supplying for the domestic market and perhaps stopping exporting. And again, very curious about how the relationships with countries occurs, because trade has been probably one of the main ways that inter-country relationships happen. It's not just at the government level, but it's company to company. So it may be a New Zealand meat company exporting to Whole Foods, or it may be an American meat company exporting to the EU. And they don't just export to the EU, they export to Carrefour or to a specific. And so those relationships, and the American supply chain is not set up to absorb all of its domestic product. So again, I just don't know what's going on here, and I'm very, very curious. Kind of changing gears for a minute here. This is a fascinating statistic for me, which is that Gen Z in particular, but really the 18 to 34-year-olds globally are reducing their alcohol consumption. And we're seeing more and more of these studies now come out in US medical journals that show that Americans of that 18 to 34 age group think that drinking is not healthy for them. And so it's curious because, of course, we also still see, binge drinking at parties and some of those things. But as a whole, what we see is this generation reducing their alcohol consumption in comparison to their parents. And if you go to the supermarkets, and I go to US supermarkets a couple of times a year and take photos, there are entire aisles now of low alcohol or no alcohol beers, no alcohol spirits. I remember when I first saw Seedlip out of the UK, there are now thousands of these kind of smell like a spirit. So they smell like gin, or they smell like vodka, or they smell like whiskey, but they don't have any alcohol in them. And then we've seen more and more of these cans that are available that are perhaps a gin and tonic without the gin, or they're a Aperol spritz without the Aperol. We see zero alcohol wine being sold. We've seen governments invest in research into how to make zero alcohol wine taste good. And it's just kind of very interesting to me. When I first started seeing it occur, I thought, oh, that's kind of vaguely interesting. But we're really now at a point where this is kind of almost past signal point and into trend. So what will it mean for the alcohol industry if people stop drinking to the extent that they have? And one of the areas I think is useful there is that starting to think perhaps again about how do we make alcohol super premium. How do you have it then be a treat rather than an everyday thing? And then the other side of it has just been the expansion of the beverage aisle in most supermarkets. So, where is the next frontier on that? We've seen the expansion of sodas. The area that I find curious when I go to the US as well, because it's so marked, is all of the functional sodas, including the sodas that contain CBD. So, massive again, kind of aisle space of CBD infused soda, which is something that we don't see in every country, but I assume that I'll start to see more and more of in the UK as well. And then just, mushrooms are in everything, right? So mushroom flavored sodas, just this functional soda, as if soda is now some kind of health food. So very interested in that. This one is kind of a really nice one. We've been talking about haptic technology for quite some time, and I kind of think I ruined my Google search stuff looking for haptics, and I'll tell you about that over a glass of wine one day. But this haptic technology is this idea of touch interface, and how do we start to use more and more touch interface in what we use in everything around us. So we've seen the growth of voice, and particularly voice is the leading technology in car development at the moment, being able to tell your car what you want it to do. But this haptic technology, the idea of really feeling technology with our fingers is fascinating. And so Portland Trail Blazers are the first professional sports team to put a haptic display at their games. So what happens is if I'm someone who's visually impaired, what I'm able to do is to pick this device up at the Ticketmaster office. I rent it, borrow it for the game. I go to the game and I can feel the game on the screen, which I think is just such an awesome use of this technology. And part of why I kind of picked this up is that we're seeing this sort of current attack on diversity and inclusion. And yet at the same time, what we're seeing is more and more of these very cool tools that make the world more accessible to people being made available. And I think one of the things that I often say is that the world is already, it's messy and contradictory, and the future will be too. And so while on one hand we might see some of these attacks against people for not being, I don't know, whatever the right alpha male is, and then we see these beautiful things, which is this is about inclusivity, this is about community, this is about pleasure, this is about being part of the group, it's about being able to go to a football game and not just hear the game, but feel the game through my fingers. And so this also makes me curious about what other kinds of haptic displays we might see in public places or available for use. Can I start to feel a Coldplay concert, not just in my body, but can I feel where they're dancing or where they're moving? Or, will Pink, when she's doing her aerial display, would she make something like this available so that the visually impaired can have a physical sensation of watching her dance or how it feels, or Beyonce's dances or whatever that might be? So I'm super excited about what applications this might have in the future. Thinking about things that also just made me smile and happy in the last little while is Lego putting out sunflower lanyard printed figurines. So what they've done is that they put out this lovely display and or lovely series, and it starts right at Duplo, which is for 2-year-olds, through to the Icon series, which is for teens. And they have the sunflower lanyard. And for those of you who don't know what the sunflower lanyard is, it's a way of indicating a hidden disability. It's used very often in airports and public spaces, libraries. Anyone can wear them anytime, but I spot them often in those places, supermarkets, places where there might be extra noise or somebody just might need a little extra consideration. And it's a way of saying, look, I might not look like I need anything, but actually I need a little more care and a little more attention and a little more love. And can you just be a little more patient? And so I think normalizing this with kids' play, children being able to see themselves is so important. And again, here having a brown-skinned child with autism, is so hard often for families to get diagnosed. And so I just love the inclusivity of this. I love that they're kind of, again, it's almost like using soft power. And coming back to thinking about signals, I love that signals can come from kind of any place. This is one I picked up on Facebook. I've picked others up out of things I read, Sally picking one up out of the tube. Signals can be all around us all the time. There's no specific way or place that you need to get them from. My last one here is just in terms of a bit of hope, is this a kind of backlash against the backlash against DEI. And so interestingly, in the US, where we've seen a number of companies decide to roll back their diversity and inclusion equity and inclusion programs, and they've done it in the face of this new kind of political order. Whereas what we've seen is people like Costco and Apple and others just sort of stand up and go, you know what, our diversity is our strength. We get better financial performance when we have diverse teams. We have better workplaces. We provide better customer service. We're better humans when we do this. And so this idea of, I think Kaila sort of brought it up once before, and I've taken that idea of there being a lash and backlash against things. So we could think, well, there was kind of the rise of the feminine. We saw more women and more people of color in top jobs around the globe. Then we've seen this backlash from kind of white male power that is feeling like I've been left behind, I'm the victim here. And then we see a third kind of round of backlash that says, you know what, we're a better place when we're all in this together. So I know the world is a little confusing at the moment, but I really hope that you see that there are exciting signals as well as ones that might be a bit depressing. I've mentioned this idea that the present is messy and contradictory and the future will be too, and that's useful. There isn't one present out here today and there isn't one future. And so part of what we need to do as futurists or in strategic foresight is to be able to hold these contradictions, yes, and to understand that there is the rise of people feeling like they can do Hitler salutes in public and the rise of backlash against that. There is the rise of the feminine, the rise of Indigenous, the rise of people of colour, and there is the rise of this kind of male domination, and then there is a backlash against it. And we need to be thinking about not that it's a specific state, but that it's currently in motion, that we will see things happen, there's a reaction, there's another reaction. And what Thomas Friedman and many other researchers have shown us is that over time, the world is getting to be a better place. And I think we often need to hold on to that we need to see that the signals may be going forwards and backwards at the same time, but over time we see that the world is becoming more democratic. We see that the world is becoming more literate. We see that the world is becoming more equal, even if at moments in time it doesn't feel like that. And I just want to finish off with two very quick things, which is a follow-up to a couple of the signals that we've talked about before. So some of you, if you've seen previous ones, I am utterly fascinated by this idea of whether we should AI the dead or not. Do the AI of the dead, does it have rights? Who owns that identity? And I'm curious about that. I think this is the most amazing use of AI of the dead that I have seen. And it wasn't, again, something when I was trying to think and predict about where AI of the dead might go. I hadn't thought about this. So again, it'll be in the links. In Thailand, this beautiful young woman was murdered by her partner. And so what they've done is made an AI of her in order to raise awareness around domestic violence. And I think this is the most extraordinary use of this ability for someone to almost come back from the dead and talk about what happened to them, why it needs to change, and how the world isn't a safe place for all people and what to do about it. And this wasn't kind of a direction I had thought about when I was thinking about the AI of the dead. I thought much more about kind of exploitative use in terms of television and movies. And we think about Carrie Fisher, or we think about Anthony Bourdain, or the other side of it is I thought about this idea of like AI and granddad so that I could go back and ask advice after he's dead. But I think this is actually a very beautiful use. And then my last one, Kaila, in our last session, talked about this campaign, and I just wanted to raise it, where what we see is Nix and Megan Rapinoe setting up a system where they will pay athletes to talk about playing sport while they have their period. And again, you know, there's so much that's sort of out there that is like repressing women's rights in a number of areas, and yet what we're seeing is more and more discussion about menopause. I feel like all around me that menopause is suddenly a big topic of conversation, and then periods, and this idea of just normalizing women's experience, normalizing women's bodies. So I wanted to show people this because I think it's just such a lovely campaign, and Kaila raised it in our last webinar. Well, that's me done. I wanted to make sure that we got some conversation, and so hopefully I got through that. Yeah, I got through that in enough time that we could really have a talk this time. And I see there's quite a lot in the chat. So over to you, Kaila.
Amazing. We have a bunch of questions that have come through on the chat. We've got at least one question in the Q&A. I'll do my best to track them wherever they are. I do just want to flag one small thing, and then I've got a thing to say, and then we'll jump into the questions in the conversation. I also have, as always, lots of thoughts and opinions. But just before I jump into that, first of all, Kim Ansell, Austin has asked us what sunflower training is. So Kim Ansell, you said you just completed your sunflower training. If you could answer that question, Austin sent it to the host and panelists, so you wouldn't have seen it. But if you could answer that question for Austin in the chat, that would be great. Before we jump into the discussion with Melissa, I want to come back to your very first slide where you said strategic foresight is a set of tools, processes, and mindsets for anticipating the future and making decisions under conditions of uncertainty. And one of the things about these sessions is that it is always fascinating to me, and I think to most of the folks on this call, regardless of what environment I'm in. It doesn't matter whether I work in the OnlyFans space or whether I work in the, football talking about period, playing while I'm on my period space. Your signals are always interesting to me. This thing about what is strategic foresight, where it gets next level interesting is how can I do what you do in a way that applies to my business? And you mentioned right at the beginning that this is the time when you get to be the client, but that you work for clients and you do this specifically for their organizations, like in ways that it goes beyond just being interesting to being something that's like, oh, this is a tool that as a leader I can use every day in order to make decisions and to guide my business into the future. And so all this to say that, of course, we have a one-day workshop with you, which we've got two of them coming up, two separate ones. One is in April, one is in November. It is called Strategic Foresight for Leaders. It is a one-dayer. And basically, if you imagine this webinar is a bunch of fish, the workshop is where you get to learn how to fish. So if you are in a leadership role, in a strategic role, in any role that involves the shaping of strategy in any way, any role that involves having to look around at the world and try to make decisions as to where it's going, I've just put the link in the chat. We've got one on the 29th of April and one on the 13th of November. So Strategic Foresight for Leaders with Melissa Clark-Reynolds ONZM. Please come along to that. Okay.
I just want to comment on that too, because we do signals in that course, but we also do two different approaches to scenarios. And I think that that's probably one of the most, I love all the signal stuff, but on top of that, I think the thing that many people get a lot out of is being able to genuinely create multiple futures and then to design strategies in your organization that genuinely make you resilient no matter how the future might turn out. So I think that's kind of the number one benefit of that course. Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, the net promoter score for that course is through the roof. Like, people love it. And I always attend and I sit up the back and I watch people, and people just like their whole bodies like change as you go through the day and as they start to like explore. Because one of the things that happens, of course, in what you've just done is you take us to places that we don't often think about. And so this leads into kind of some of the comments and thoughts that I had, which was, you mentioned about OnlyFans. These are in no particular order because my notes are just kind of all over the show. But you mentioned about OnlyFans and how, we'll look back and see how much innovation, online innovation, was driven by the porn industry. And I would add to that porn and crime. And I remember Mark Goodman, who wrote the book Future Crime, who was a friend of ours through Singularity University, talking about these like cyber attacks where they would freeze your thing, you had to pay in Bitcoin, but where the folks doing the cyber attacks were like, they had huge companies. And so they'd freeze your computer and they'd go, you need to pay us in Bitcoin, but don't worry, we have tech support to help you get the Bitcoin. And then we have tech support to help you get your stuff back online once you paid. And I would hazard a guess that if we were to look for it, they would also be among the earliest adopters of like AI tech support to help you get your Bitcoin so you can pay us your ransom so we can get you back online faster. Yeah. So these kind of like what people might consider like edge cases, but that are actually really driving the real world use cases for these innovations. All right.
Remote work during COVID. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of that in the sex industry, and haptics, being able to send someone a device that, is, you feel the device and that somebody else can run remotely. Like, all of this area has been an explosion, as it were, of research and technology. When we look at a bunch of the 3D gaming, a whole lot of that has also ended up being driven by porn. And again, I'm like super clear, like last time we talked about whether people should sell their organs or not. I'm not talking about, kind of, do I think this is good or bad? It's just fascinating to me.
Yeah. We had a talk, and we can include it in the follow-up email to this. We had a talk years ago at TEDx Christchurch from two people, and they were talking about remote-controlled sex toys, basically. and how they can be hacked, and how basically this is like sexual assault at a distance.
Wow.
And then also they can be hacked in environments where that kind of thing might be illegal, and
Right.
you can track like where people are using what. So
Right.
anyway, we'll include that talk. It was really fascinating. On that haptics front, I would just say I watched a video of that company's technology, of a guy using it, and it's, again, we'll include the video in the post email. It's so worth a watch. It's so gorgeous. It's so
It is.
exciting. This guy's like such a super fan, and he was like, I had no idea they move so fast, and this has made the game so much more exciting for him. It's a
Yeah.
really wonderful thing. Okay, some other thoughts and comments. You all can submit your question. I got my own. So some other thoughts. Right at the beginning, you mentioned your very first thing, which was about the fragrance and the status symbol. And one of the business models for me that's so fascinating is, it's not really a business model, but more of a positioning, this concept of affordable luxuries, and
Yeah.
how, very few people can afford a Ferrari, but many more people can afford an iPhone. And an affordable luxury, I think, works best where it's a little bit of a stretch in terms of cash, just enough that it's a stretch, that that I have enough to pay this, and it's visible. And I thought about that when you were talking about Starlink and the backlash to Elon Musk, and whether there will be the same backlash. And my first thought was, I hypothesized that no,
Mm.
because you don't know, when do you ever come to my house and know who my internet provider is?
Yeah, true.
And my hypothesis would be that it will only be a backlash for those kinds of large government contracts where it is quite a visible thing.
Yeah, interesting. Let's see.
Let's see. Exciting. Okay. I'm going to get to a question. I've got more stuff, but I'm going to get to a question here. So Tim Brown was asking about your comment about the drinking. And I feel like I'm 6 years this month, 6 years sober. And I feel like absolutely this is a good time in history to be sober, because it is so common now. Tim wants to know, he thinks at least part of the reduction in drinking is probably due to the legalization of cannabis. You mentioned cannabis. Would you associate those two things together?
There is some debate around that, and there's been some research in California, of course, around the rise of the use of CBD and of edibles and so on around drinking. But interestingly, there isn't actually really good research that this 18 to 34 group has taken that up in a great rate. So I don't know. Like, it might be. But it seems that it's more older people who are the enthusiasts than necessarily young people.
Yeah. It certainly feels, the drinking thing particularly feels like it is now at a minimum socially acceptable, and in many instances cool, to not drink.
Yeah.
And so it feels like you said, it migrating almost from a signal to a trend. Like the zeitgeist is like, oh yeah, whereas 10 years ago, oh no, I'm good. Oh, do you have a problem? Or is there
Yeah. Are you pregnant?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Right. Okay. Erica Brooks says, in terms of current NZ politics, what are your thoughts around the Prime Minister's stated growth-oriented economy versus other more future-oriented, sustainable economic models, e.g., circular, regenerative, well-being economies?
Huh. I'm going to take this out to a more global thing, because I think we see that most countries have growth policies, and we know that you can't grow forever. I sat on New Zealand's Green Growth Panel about a decade ago, and we had some big discussions, even 10 years ago, about whether or not growth was sustainable. I don't see how we're going to be able to double our exports, which is one of the New Zealand stated goals. But having said that, we see the growth of these regenerative and circular economies. I sit on the board of a meat company which is dedicated to regenerative agriculture. We do no GMO, we do antibiotic free, we do GAP, which is the highest animal welfare standards we can be awarded, and we get well paid in the markets for doing those things, including for certified regen. And I think that's quite important too, that it's not just the vibe of regen, it's actually getting certification. And we're aligned with Savory Institute, but I think Regenesis in the US also does a great job. There is organic regen. I do think that these certifications make a difference. And so again, this question, do you want to fight for a commodified product, or do you want to fight for a premium? come back to that idea of affordable luxury. In many markets, regeneratively labelled products are getting double the price. So Alexandra Farms in the US gets double the price for their milk, which is certified Regen A2, no GMO, compared to regular white milk. So we see that those premiums are there. We see that the customers want them. The nice thing about a country like New Zealand is we only produce a small amount of everything, and we can go after niches if we want. And so personally, I believe if you want to make more profit, you are better to make less stuff and make better stuff. And so this question of what is growth, it's probably a whole other webinar, but I certainly see that there are consumers out there who are not just willing to pay, who are paying extra for those products, and they are niche, and that's okay because 340 farms is basically what we can take our meat from, and you can't feed the whole world with that. So it's cool with us.
Amazing. Okay, we've got a question here from Ben Van Bruggen, who says we are increasingly urbanizing. Some cities and city mayors are resisting national directives from central government. They are seeking more autonomy. Mm-hmm. Cities are making global alliances with each other. What signals have you seen about the future of the city?
Oh, so curious. I've given a number of talks around the world recently about the future of the city. I spent quite a bit of time in Copenhagen, and I got to meet with one of their deputy mayors for urbanisation. And I think there are Ontario as a state, as opposed to a city, came out again today with their own statements about tariffs. And I thought that was very interesting that you could have both Canada have an approach to American tariffs, and then a state decide that it might put its own tariffs on US products. And so I think the future of the city is very interesting. On one hand, we have seen urbanisation, but what we've seen post-COVID is actually the growth of smaller urban areas. We've seen people move to sort of rural towns and cities in a way globally that hasn't happened for a long time. And we've seen both the rise of the city and the rise of the small town, because it's possible to work from anywhere as long as you have good internet access. I'm a big fan of the 15-minute cities. I know there are people who think that's a terrible thing, but I can't understand why I wouldn't want to walk everywhere. I'm a big fan of public transport. I love what Melbourne has done. Melbourne, through its planting and landscaping projects, has managed to reduce the temperature of the city by at least 2 degrees. And so I think we see all of that. We should do just a whole session on the city sometime, but I'm excited about what smart cities can do, how they can work, how things like those haptics can make them safer places for everybody. But I'm seeing a lot of cities going very green, regardless of what their countries might be doing. And I think that the city movement in terms of impacts on climate change is much, much stronger than country movements.
It's so massive, this concept of even just planting shade trees in the US, where in areas that were historically redlined, which was a practice where the banks would literally draw they weren't allowed to discriminate by race. And so they would draw a red line around predominantly Black neighborhoods, and they would just say, we're just not lending in this neighborhood. We're not discriminating by race, but it's just this neighborhood. Whoever happens to be in the neighborhood happens to be in the neighborhood. And this was a practice almost a century ago. And today, neighborhoods adjacent to redline neighborhoods are 1.7 degrees cooler. Like non-redline neighborhoods are 1.7 degrees cooler than historically redline neighborhoods. Today, that the effects are still flowing through because of the underinvestment in shade trees and in plantings and things like that. Okay, we've got a question here from Mark Neal, who says, we can track historic economic measures of inequality. Can we do the same for social measures like polarization and divergence of trends?
Well, we can. It's not my specialty area, but I do know that there's a whole pile of that work done. DM me, message me. I can send you some links if you haven't got them, but yes is the answer.
Right. Yeah. Okay. We got a question from our dear friend, Nicola Woodward. I'm wondering if the current shift in geopolitical relations has implications for the future source and supply of tech, and if this has implications for tech culture and security.
Oh, look, I think the last few years have been really fascinating. Yeah, I've done some work I'm not sure if I can talk about, but anyway, I've done some work on like where hackers are. The Ukraine conflict or Russia's invasion of Ukraine actually like caused quite a shift in a lot of technology. We knew that, so Ukraine, I think it was 200,000 coders came off coding to go into the army. And that changed a lot over the last 2 to 3 years. It's just a massive shift. And even on the other side, we've seen kind of Russia with large investments in some of the cyber stuff, again, getting quite distracted by having to go into military service or having to work on other things. So when we think tech, we have to not just think the kind of the good tech, but you've got to think about the hackers and where they all are as well. So I think we've seen a couple of those big tilts in the last few years. The Israel-Gaza conflict has also changed the tech landscape in Israel and slowed things down quite markedly. And curious to me that those are two of the countries where we've seen, really a lot of innovation come from, or the regions we've seen a lot of innovation come from. India is obviously still doing a lot of innovation. China is still doing a lot of innovation. And of course, the US, when you look at what's happening, Palo Alto and Boston in particular have always been centers of innovation. A lot of the tech company concern over the changes to visas in the US has been the use of migrants. So migrants come to the US, they come to university, and then they either start and stay businesses. So the number one starter of tech businesses in the US are Indian migrants. And so they've come to university, they go to MIT or they go to Harvard or they go to, Stanford, they start a startup, they stay, and they employ masses of Americans. And there are some real concerns over the kind of current what's happening with visas in the US as to whether that will slow down American innovation and where that innovation will go to. So at the moment, it is still the centre of gravity for many people to want to go to. It's still the centre of investment in technology. It's still where you're most likely to get your startup funded at a decent rate. It's still got massive customer base on your doorstep. So if I was going to do a robotics startup, I'd still want to do that in California or Boston. I'd want that those investors, and I'd want that customer base. So I think that the demand will stay very strong in the US, regardless of what the politics might be, even in the next 5 years. If that carries on and it becomes a very difficult place to immigrate to for maybe 10 or 15 years, I think the US will lose its centrality as an innovation nation. But there's quite a long runway to go in that. Money is patient. It will wait 5 years for a shift. And at the moment, Trump can't stand one more time under the current rules. So it'll be curious to see what the next president is. And I think you have to take those longer term views.
Interesting. So I've got a couple of thoughts on this. One is I recently read Packy, I forget his last name, Packy, he's a VC, writes a newsletter. And there is a school of tech entrepreneur innovators who feel that the current climate is the optimal climate for them because all brakes are off. And so I'll forward you this this newsletter, and we can include a link in the follow-up email. And Rach, I hope you're capturing all these things I'm saying. We'll include the link. But he wrote a thing just after inauguration. I don't know how he feels today, but he wrote a thing just after inauguration where he was like, "We've got 4 years to have a hard run at everything we want to do because all restrictions have been lifted." And so.
Curious, isn't it? Because entrepreneurs often want all the brakes off.
Yeah.
But we also see that innovation within constraint is commercializable fast.
Yeah.
And so, it's like of what you wish for versus what do you actually succeed in. Again, it'll be so interesting to come back in 4 years and go, I wonder what happened.
Yeah, and I don't think he's sent through any kind of update on whether what's happened in the first, 100 days has been what he was hoping for,
Yeah.
or like it has met those expectations. The other thing that came to mind as you were talking earlier, when you were talking about trade and how we do business with Carrefour, not just with the European Union, that McDonald's theory of diplomacy, that no two countries that both have a McDonald's have ever gone to war against each other. I don't know if that's still true.
I don't
Maybe
know.
apocryphal when it happened, but anyway, I thought that was interesting. I have one more kind of small comment, and then I've got a question here from Scott Mallory that I have some thoughts on as well. So I want to get to that before we sign off. My one more small comment is back on the no alc, lower no alc, is I'm also seeing these now offered on airlines. And so Air New Zealand in there will have that GNT, no alc GNT. In the US, they will have some of that. It's not LaCroix, but it's like, I forget what it's called, Uhu or Aha, it's called, like flavored sparkling water. And so, seeing them there as well. And I was thinking as you were talking about that signal, that airlines are often a good place to look for signals because it's such a great test bed. Like you've got a captive audience, you're on there, you can readily get, like, you're going to choose from these 5 things. So immediately you get data about like, okay, we would expect 12% of people to choose this option, but 17 did, that's a really strong signal for where we're heading. All right. Question from Scott Mallory. I think it's just the last one we got time for. You mentioned the rise of people of color. We see the ecosystem responding in ways that go up and down, like how the United Nations declared 2015 to 2024 as the International Decade for People of African Descent. What does the future of DEI look like? And the thought that I had written down on this was, when you talked about the lash and the backlash, the thing that I think, the phenomenon that I think drives the lash and the backlash is the move towards extremes that exclude, basically. So when we're going, it's the year of the feminine and of indigenous peoples and of people of color, and white men go take a seat. Then the backlash is, hang on a second, I'm a white man, why should I go take a seat? And so I'm going to go reclaim my power, and now it's going to be the rise of the white man, and I'm going to exclude all these others, then we're going to hang on a second, whatever. And I say this because our dear friend Mateo Brown and the work that he does to uplift men. My niece a couple of years ago got me to watch this movie that I was really judgy about before I watched it, like prejudged. It was called The Red Pill. I'm like, she's like, you have to watch this movie. It's on YouTube and it's called The Red Pill. And I was like, oh my gosh, are you serious? I do not want to watch this movie. And it was about men's rights. And I watched the movie and I was like, oh, right. This is like, okay, men die earlier and they have the shittier jobs and they are treated this way, whatever. And so what I'm throwing into this conversation, and I don't know how close it is to Scott's question, but what I'm throwing into this conversation is this thing of like, can we work towards the rise of what does the inclusive world look like? What does the inclusive leadership look like? What does leadership look like that elevates humanity and is not about characterized by a like this group ascendant? Go.
In 10 seconds. I think, like I've talked before too about like we see this like gender is shifting quite strongly, and so all cultures have had histories of multiple genders, like all cultures. And so we see that at times that might get codified into 2 genders. At other times that might be more genders than we can imagine. Most languages around the world have words for many genders. At least 3, if not more. And so I want to use that kind of lens for a moment. Is that what we see is that whether it's the rise of Indigenous or the rise of people of African descent or the rise of women, we see that as that proliferates, the kind of in, not in changes, right? So the kind of who's in the in group and who's in the out group, and the group that is fighting for the past. What I don't think they often realize is mostly they're fighting for a very recent past. They're fighting for a past that's possibly only existed for 1 or 2 generations. And they fight hard for that past, but inexorably the future kind of carries on. And it might go down some dead ends. I think about there are these wonderful pictures of women in Afghanistan in miniskirts and kind of looking like Beatles fans in the 70s to, losing rights to go to university today. But once you have had the taste of that, it comes back. When we think about in New Zealand, it's taken 150 years for many tribes to get their land back, but the land is back. And where that then goes is, it'll have eddies like in a river. It will go some steps back, it will go some steps forward. But we do see things moving in the right direction. And I think that's the thing to take, is that there will be reactions. There will be the fight for the past. People will stand up and fight for what they believe the past is. But as a futurist, I just kind of see that those are temporary. And if we think about time as a much bigger thing, maybe 5 or 10 years of a backlash just enables the conversation to come out in a new way so that we can get ready for the next conversation. That may not be the answer that you were expecting, but I do feel like we have to think about it as just a flow of a river, in and out, onwards.
Amazing. Melissa, we are out of time. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. It's been such a delight to host you this morning. I have put the link again to Melissa's workshop in the chat. It really is such a spectacular day and a day that as leaders, I came out of that day just feeling like, oh my gosh, I have so many more specific tools now to think about strategy, to think about where my business is headed, let alone where the world around me is headed. So cannot recommend it highly enough. Obviously, everyone has, heard from you and what a fantastic and engaging presenter you are. Like, it's just a delight to spend a day with you, full stop. But the program itself, just so many incredibly valuable takeaways. Thank you everyone for tuning in, for your questions. We will send out the video of this session, of course, along with a bunch of the links and references. We do these every 6 months. Melissa brings new signals every 6 months. So please come back 6 months from now to hear what is new on her mind. And as she said right at the beginning, please send her the signals you're noticing so that we can crowdsource them and she can find out what you're following. So Melissa, thank you so much once again. Really appreciate it.
Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for coming.
All right. Take care. Kia ora.